Ciao, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Professor Barry here, and we are in week 2 now. I guess a couple things as we get started. Last week we covered theory. Well, covered what is sociology, just to kind of define the discipline of sociology, kind of its focus and looking at the social world, and then got into the 3 theories and their application to popular culture. So you should be pretty kind of grounded in sort of the parameters, the general kind of idea of sociology and some of its theoretical frameworks. If you ever have any questions about content, you know, drop me an email, let me know, or about the structure of the class, kind of what's required, let me know. Definitely, help you out to kind of navigate, especially the first couple of weeks as you're trying to figure out kind of the layout of the class, just creating a schedule for yourself and all that kind of good stuff. So yeah, after the first couple of weeks, it kind of, it's consistent. So yeah, after a couple of weeks, you probably get smoother as you kind of move down the road. All right, so just a little bit of background, just a little stuff to check in with you. This week, you got a couple different podcasts, try to integrate some different materials. So it's not all reading in the class. There's this great podcast called The Social Breakdown, kind of some interaction between 3 different, I think they're doctoral students in sociology, kind of breaking it down. So these ideas, so they kind of have a couple good ones on, or useful ones, informative ones on popular culture that we're going to kind of get into this week. So the focus here of the lecture is really about defining, explaining culture, providing a couple different ideas and perspectives about culture, and then using our sociological theories to kind of examine culture. So that is where we are going. Started off, here with this particular slide here. Let's see if I can kind of enlarge that. There we go. Yeah, popular culture is this fascinating place, and it's so rich for examining culture and society and cultural ideas about gender, in this case of Harry Styles, right? It's like, it's like this popular culture icon making some commentary about cultural ideas about gender. Popular culture includes so many different forms of culture: sports, mass media, fashion, the arts, music, the stuff in our, mass consumption, anything about consumption, all these different things that are ripe for examination. I think it's one rich area to examine in popular culture. We spend our lives immersed in this area, and it's something we do not know a lot about, and don't have a lot of formal critiques or formal frameworks to think about popular culture. So one of the, I think, significant values of this class and other classes that address popular culture is it helps us to better understand this world that we are immersed in. Hold on one second here. All right. Yeah, I had a project in a previous term students worked on, looked at a particular product and had them look at an advertisements, going back multiple decades, and then comparing it to contemporary ads. And one student chose Carhartt overalls. That's really interesting, comparison. You can kind of, through examining advertisements, we can examine what changes have gone on in terms of culture. And there's different aspects of culture we could start addressing. Think about technology, institutions like advertising and the mass media, cultural ideas about gender, race, class, a lot of different things to kind of examine with that. The media, and examining the mass media, we can kind of get into all different kind of things about audience response, audience interpretation. Think about what the media constructs. So the representations in the media, race, class, gender, other aspects of our social lives. How does the media represent? How does it frame issues? A lot to kind of go on there. This film, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, came out, I don't know, it's been 10 plus years now. But a really interesting film about a documentary looking at the both the origins of hip hop, and then once it started to become a mass commodity. So once it got co-opted by the recording industry, hip hop moved from this cultural art, this Black art form in the inner city, and it moved to this sort of mainstream. There's mainstream mass market music videos that had a lot to do with white middle class sensibilities, and less to do with like the origins of hip hop itself. There's still definitely a hip hop subculture that stays true to some of those roots. But once it became part of this sort of big production music industry, it became a product of capital, and that changes the form of that particular art. So those are kind of some of the things to kind of examine and think about. So let's kind of go through our main themes. And first of all, we need to define culture. Well, what is culture, right? So it's patterns. One way you could define it, it's like the patterns of meanings. So the way that we think about the world, and the consistency or the patterns that exist or that emerge within in a particular place or people. So there's pattern meanings. We don't all think the same. We don't all have the same meanings, but there are meanings, but there are patterns out there within a particular geographic space and historical time period. So some of these patterns and meanings can be things like our beliefs, or culture could also include beliefs, the rituals that we engage in. Super Bowl Sunday, man, it's a ritual for many people. Artistic creations, sort of what we do in terms of creation of art, traditions, language, artifacts, objects are part of culture. We can examine artifacts to examine things that are going on within culture, cultural symbols, and practices, the things that we do. So it's a host of different things that are part of culture. Culture is like an essential part of any social group, any organization, and we're thinking very macro, any society. Culture is really important because culture is a place where we establish meaning, where we establish order, a sense of boundary in terms of group boundary. Culture is a place where we engage and solve problems. So culture is a necessary part of social functioning, a necessary part of functioning, of establishing a social order. The meaning that we develop, so humans don't come with any meaning, right? So we don't come out of the womb with any particular meaning, but we learn things. Everything is learned. So we learn things in interaction, and those interactions are, shaped by the time period in which we are gaining meaning. Think about gender, for example, and the ways we think about masculinity and femininity. How much of that is influenced by the time period we grow up in, the social position that we grow up in terms of our class position, racial position, our place in terms of regionally in the United States, that might shape it, urban versus rural. All these things kind of shape the ways in which we think about gender. The anthropologist Franz Boas, had this sort of idea that through and within culture, we develop this worldview. So it's like it's that learning process, right? And that it's so valuable and important and necessary for our own survival. It gives us belonging, connection, a sense of integrating us into a larger group, and it's helpful for us to navigate the social world. So if you don't know the culture, it's hard to navigate, right? It's like for those who've traveled outside the United States or gone to maybe even in the United States, gone to a different region, it takes a while sometimes to figure out what are the cultural norms and the expectations, the practices, the rituals. They're different, and the more you learn them, the more what those are, you can navigate those systems better. So in this way, culture becomes a toolkit. It's something that we can draw from to both understand the world and to navigate the world. It's a toolkit more than it is like it's determinate. So I put versus determinism in how we think and our own ideas. So in other words, it's a toolkit that we all develop a toolkit. Not all of us have the same tools in that toolkit. So we live in culture, but it doesn't mean we all think the same, or that we engage in the same rituals, or that we engage in the same traditions. But we're immersed in this culture, and we all develop a tool bag, a toolkit. So it's not determined just because we live in this particular social space that we all get the same toolkit. We don't all acquire the same knowledge or develop the same interpretations and the same meaning. And we're getting into the sociological perspective in culture. What we're kind of interested in is examining, well, what are the meanings within culture? We're going to examine social meanings. Then we're going to look at the impact of social meanings as well. So we're going to look at the construction of meaning. Where do those meanings come from? And then look at the impact of those meanings at the individual level, maybe at a societal level. A sociological analysis of culture begins at the premise that culture provides orientation. It gives us a sense of like understanding, helping us to navigate. It wards off chaos. It gives us a sense of what are the parameters, what are the rules, and directs behavior towards certain things and away from others. So it gives us guidance on sort of what norms and expectations are. Culture provides meaning and order through the use of symbols. So it's this engagement in and thinking about the symbolic world. These charts, Griswold is, this is where they came from, a academic named Griswold, these charts about the cultural diamond. And they provide a useful way of thinking about culture and how we can break it down from a social perspective or some of the things we can kind of work with. Let's kind of start here on the left and then kind of move over here. So at the most basic form or simple form, you have the artist, right? So the person who, the creator, the person who creates objects, creates expressions, human expressions. You have the context in which things are being created. So yeah, or which that artist is within. So historical time period, geographic space, societal space, social position. So the social context is important. So it's the artist, the social context, then we go into the cultural object. So what is created itself, right? And then the audience, those who experience it, those who engage with or experience that object. So there's kind of like this four aspects of this triangle of thinking about cultural and cultural objects. The artist, I mean, if you have ever had art history, I encourage you to take art history. It's such a fascinating class. And you can sort of, get into a lot about thinking about, we're examining the cultural context, historical context, how that's shaping art, how that's shaping, the social position of the artist, shaping the art itself, the interpretations from the general public, the art form itself, the object. So these things are sort of like, in relationship to each other. This one on the right here just adds a little bit more, and the reason I included is basically the same, but adds a little bit more nuance that we can kind of get into a little bit. So think about the artist. When I said the simple form, it's that individual creator. Well, now we kind of move into, well, the creator could be an individual, but it's also an industry, right? Creating cultural expressions. So I go back to Harry Styles. I go, okay, well, no longer is it like the individual artist, the photographer, maybe in this case, but now we're thinking about an industry, and kind of get into something about the cultural industry that's shaping, influencing what representations, what we see, what we're exposed to, framing social issues, the culture industry. Now we start to break down the industry itself and start thinking about interesting things about, well, what are the demographics of those who are making decisions with the industry? What's the gender distribution of people who are making decisions, the racial distribution of people making decisions? And we can kind of go down this sort of pathway and start thinking about the logic of cultural industries. Where do they come from? Historical kind of perspective. I mean, just a host of things to kind of get into. And then we can kind of get into the receiver level, the audience level, and say, okay, well, people see this object, right? They can be either passive, consumers or audience members may be passive. They're just enjoying things as entertainment and not critically examining things. Or audience members can be much more active, much more reflective, much more engaged in sort of thinking about that particular thing and unpackaging it a little bit. So, in this case, like the audience member may see this Vogue magazine cover, don't think anything of it, pretty passive audience. Or people could start, audience members may be more active, start questioning, critiquing, understanding, engaging with those particular art forms. So that's just kind of an example. Here's culture food. It's so fun to look at. So Joey Chestnut, this year, 75 hot dogs in 10 minutes, a hot dog eating competition. There's a podcast, it's not required this week, but if you look at the syllabus, there's a podcast, Inside the Extreme Sport of Competitive Eating. It's a 22-minute podcast on competitive eating, a researcher who was looking at that. Thinking about cultural differences, United States versus other countries. And this is not a practice that's in every country. You have these competitive eating, and it's a reflection of culture. It's a long history of the hot dog eating competition in New York City, Nathan's Hot Dogs. Yeah, so part of culture, right? Food, part of culture. The rise and development of vegetable-based meat products. There's so many different things that kind of get into with that technology, ideas about gender itself. And that'll come through later when we talk about gender and food, which is not obvious at first, but you start to go through it and you go, oh, okay, that makes kind of sense. But yeah, so it's like, okay, changes are going on in culture. Culture is dynamic. We have McDonald's in the 1950s, first time emerging a fast food restaurant. Hard to believe, but it's difficult to get people to go to fast food restaurants. Families ate at home for the most part. I mean, if people went out, they didn't bring their kids with them and things like that. McDonald's hamburgers in some ways came about because of the development of the highway system, the Eisenhower Highway Act, the 1950s. During a time period after the war, is kind of during and after the war, building an interstate highway system to facilitate the movement of military personnel and military equipment around the United States. And then you have these highways. Now, it emerges, this sort of fast food restaurant came out of Bakersfield, California. That's like, an interesting story. The stories that, cultural things that are going on, there's always a backstory of things that are happening. And examining food is an examination of class, regional kind of things, right? Food is a sort of interesting space that you can kind of get into. Maybe if you can kind of draw back here, there's not an artist, but think about, okay, let's go look at vegetable-based beef, vegetable-based meat protein products. So you have an industry creating things, right? Changes going on, technology facilitating things, mass marketing, development, different things going on within culture and sensibilities. Okay, what is the consumer? How do they think about things like Beyond Beef, the Impossible beef, vegetable beef patties, protein patties, and then the object itself. So this kind of gives us a framework that diamond gives us, sort of lays out a framework that we can use in thinking about culture. Okay, so now let's move into theoretical views of culture. We're going to first start off with this idea that culture is a mirror or a reflection, and then we're going to get into the two of our three theories and their application to culture. So first, kind of conceptually, to kind of think about that culture, to some degree, is a mirror or a reflection of things going on in society itself. And there's some theory some philosophy going back to ancient Greece. Plato theorizing, Aristotle theorizing about culture. So there's a long history about thinking about culture. And one idea that emerged is that human expressions, forms of art, are reflections or mirrors of things that are going on within culture and society itself. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one ratio. I don't know if you ever heard of the Grimm fairy tales. This becomes one example. I mean, like the development of fairy tales and the moral conundrums and those stories. Those stories are, I'm going to go back here again real quick. Those stories are, compared to today, they were produced, but they're also, those stories were passed on more orally versus there's no mass marketing. Grimm fairy tales, I'd have to go back, but we're going back a couple hundred years to get to the Grimm fairy tales. I can't remember what time period, but a couple hundred years, let's say. And didn't have mass marketing, mass consumption, all those different kind of things. Those fairy tales were stories and fables, the fables that people told, the myths, the stories, right? Those are things that were communicated to people, and it's the way people learn morals, values, ideals. They were expressions of things that were going on in the social world itself. And those fairy tales had within them important life lessons. If there were things that were had things about violence within them, some of those fairy tales are pretty gory compared to contemporary standards, pretty like frightening in some ways. That's a reflection of the human condition and the human experience. I mean, that's the idea, is that culture gets us into things that are going on within the human experience itself. So we look at violence in video games, violence in mass media. In some ways, that's our own fascination with violence. It's our own ways in which we engage in this area of violence. It doesn't mean it's a one-to-one ratio, that what we see in terms of violence in television, that is an actual one-to-one replication of things that are going on in the social world. And these are representations. And the bigger picture here, the bigger issues, that culture and what's going on within culture and its products and sort of things that are circulating within the culture is a reflection to some extent of the human experience. And art and media is an imitation or reflection of some cultural truths about the human experience, not a one-to-one ratio. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So just want to think about that culture is a expression. Culture is a place of, is through culture, we express the human experience and things that are going on, our own conundrums, worries, concerns, things like that. Now let's kind of get into theory. Okay, so we're going to go after the functionalist perspective first, and talk about some of the main ideas and try to apply them to some of these different images you see here. So the ideas you read about last week, right, from a functionalist perspective, that society is a problem-solving entity. Society has a complex system, all these different parts of the system all working to create stability and order. Institutions exist to address human and social needs. So the mass media exists to address human and social needs. Art form does that, entertainment, human expression, all these things exist to address our human needs. Cultural institutions and their creations, including things like media representations, reflect our cultural ideals, the things that we value, the things that we support, the things that that are part of our kind of cultural value and belief system. And they insist in maintaining a sense of sharedness across the system itself, across the culture society, and helps to maintain order. So cultural creations, you get this sort of that culture and institutions that are creations that are helping to communicate commonly held values and beliefs, helping to create order and stability. I mean, that's what cultural institutions kind of do. To kind of go back, the first part of our discussion today is, okay, what's culture do? Culture is a place to orient ourselves, to provide direction. And when you think about, if we had a society, the world population, so the population in the United States today is about what the world population was in the mid-1500s. So just think about that for a moment. I mean, we have about 380 million people in the United States. That was the world population about 500 years ago. You just go, wow, man, wow, it's just crazy to think about, what life would be like without these cultural institutions, despite all their problems and issues and conundrums about them. That you can start to see one of the values and benefits of the mass media and representation. It's a way of communicating certain cultural ideals, a way of developing a sense of understanding, that toolkit that we develop. Primary function of the news, something interesting to think about. Primary function of the news and other media is not passing on information, although that's one of the functions, but it's not necessarily the primary function. Right. So primary function of the news media, one could argue, is really, it's the symbolic production. It's this sort of underlying thing is what we're being exposed to, the stories that we hear. It's creating a sense of the social self, creating a sense of our place within culture and society, of learning culture. So think about, like, with COVID, the primary function of the news isn't necessarily the passing along of information about what's going on with COVID, but rather orienting ourselves to what are the norms, expectations, understanding what's going on in the social world. And that's kind of difficult to tease out, but the bigger issue trying to kind of get at here is that thinking about these institutions, their function, like the mass media, one of the functions is to provide information. I mean, it's with journalism, and we hope the integrity of journalism to be able to do that job of to inform the public. But I think a higher function is not only to inform, but it's also to communicate and establish a sense of commonality, common story, developing that sort of broader sense of kind of culture. And then an important thing here too is we have this sort of a national community and imagined communities. So an event happens, let's say, a hurricane happens, we don't get those in Oregon, but we become part of an imagined community. Let's say go back to a major hurricane or a major event, tragedy, disaster happens in a different part of the United States. We becomes part of our imagined community. A subculture becomes part of our imagined community, perhaps. So community could be a national community that we develop the sense of like nationalism, or it could be imagined communities. The limitations of the theory is it doesn't address very well questions of power, inequality, questions of who's creating representations, who's shaping that content, and the audience itself, how audiences may be interpreting things that are going on within the media. So there's some limitations there with this particular model. The Black Panther movie came out, I don't know, a couple of years ago, a Black superhero. And this was a celebrated film because of the production of having the production coming from a different space. The production of the film itself, where Blacks were more essentially Black artist, filmmaker, more directly involved in the production of the film. And representation. So there's like, okay, this is a changing going on within culture. Representation, in some ways, it changes going on within culture itself. And these cultural symbols and icons are a way for us to, it's an expression of things that are going on within culture. The Olympics 2020, part of an imagined global community. One of the functions of the Olympics, is through sports, is to bring people together around the world in celebration of, our common humanity, athleticism. It gets us exposed. We become exposed to different countries from around the world. And there's all this cool functional stuff you can think about with the Olympics. This is a show that our family watched for a while called This Is Us. Kind of interesting family drama, and the cast of characters, pretty diverse representations in terms of this family. And I don't know, I just pulled that out here to say, like, look at our TV shows and programming, we start to kind of think about, at least I think about, you kind of go here, what's being created. In some ways, what's being created is a reflection of things that are going on in the social and cultural world. So as audience members are are more racially, ethnically diverse, sexual orientation, gender diversity, our TV shows and representations start to change and reflect that to some degree. But again, there's some limitations to that, and that's kind of what maybe conflict theory can kind of get us into. So conflict theory is a little bit different perspective, well, majorly different perspective. And thinking about the mass media, thinking about popular culture, both these theories are valuable. They get us they give us kind of frameworks in which we can think about popular culture. So don't try to avoid thinking about one's right and one's wrong, but they're different lenses to put on to think about popular culture or to analyze and examine culture. So conflict theory, starting off this idea of materialism. There's a whole philosophical underpinning of what materialism is versus, I believe I put here, it's not there, but it's idealism for the functionalist perspective. So that there's sort of the ideal forms in terms of values and beliefs and the sort of larger society piece, and that things circulate, get created based on our ideal values and morals and things like that. Conflict theory goes sort of at another way and says, okay, it's our material structure, not our possessions, but material structure is the political economy. So this may be a little bit conceptually difficult to kind of get into, but materialism is the material conditions. Agricultural-based society versus a society of capitalism. Capitalism operates in different societies in different ways. So it's how capitalism is structured. It's the structure of that economic system which determines institutions, and then ultimately things filter through institutions, and that's what we as individuals get exposed to. So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, what materialism is. So you kind of like, we're looking at it now, we're looking at overall much more, our focus is on the larger structure, how things are structured and how things filter through the structure down to the individual. The conflict theory perspective, okay, you know, we get into that our consciousness, our values and our beliefs are a social product. So things that are learned. Everything's learned in terms of our value, beliefs, and things like that. Our consciousness, what we hold to be dear and true, our understandings about social life, social conditions, that's all learned stuff. But where does it come from and why? The conflict theory perspective would kind of link up that part of what is learned is coming from, or what's shaping our beliefs and our values is coming from these big institutions. And that's part of what Marx would call the superstructure. Karl Marx, conflict theorist, Marxist perspective. We talk about it's the superstructure. And I'll show you a diagram here to illustrate where the superstructure falls. But the superstructure is the belief factories, ideology factories, like where our ideas about the social world come from. They're being produced by these institutions. So the culture industries are part of the superstructure. Marx would also include, you know, religion and religious institutions as being part of the superstructure. One famous statement that Marx made is that the ruling ideas in society, the dominant views in society, are the ideas of the ruling class. So the ruling class, their interests are being represented through institutions, and the consciousness that we develop is the consciousness that aligns with the interest of the ruling class. It's not simply deterministic, like we get exposed and audience members are passive and are unable to be critical. It's more likely to be sort of thinking about there's degrees of influence. In some ways, we're not even aware of issues that are going on. We are involved ourselves with popular culture, the mass media and production, but we're not even aware of things that are going on or develop a really critical view and critical to be more informed and educated, to be more empowered and to be more conscious about things that are going on. And then you got Gramsci and Gramsci, if you recall back to week one, so Antonio Gramsci, the Prison Notebooks was his famous writings. He was incarcerated during the rise of, in Italy under Mussolini, the rise of fascism in Europe, Western Europe, and he came up with this idea of hegemony, domination by consent, that the way to control a population is not through a strong state or military, but to control how they think, to control their consciousness. And Gramsci puts a domination by consent. So audience members are supporting, engaging with the ideas of the ruling class, not even maybe knowing it, but they're actively involved in the process. So it's not just sort of like this top-down view. I don't know, I just pulled this up, looking for information on the newsroom and like who are the editors, what's the racial composition, gender composition. I think you can get into class composition, would be interesting as well. And you just start to go, okay, well, as an institution, start to ask questions about, well, who's involved in the production of information itself? It may shape what stories are told, how stories are told. Tim Wu, this book called The Attention Merchants, it's a pretty good read. It was basically looking at the advertising industry and basically, I mean, back up for a second. He was working on legislation, federal legislation, being involved with Congress in examining basically the rise and development of Facebook and social media, companies and the data. So data privacy issues that he got interested in. And then to get there, he went way back to like the beginning development of advertising. And then and it's basically an industry that's trying to grab our attention And he looks at the historical development over a course of time. And the reason I brought this up in it's sort of a conflict theory, if you look at things like, with Facebook and social media, in one way, it's like, okay, from a functionalist viewpoint, we can go there and think about social media, but the conflict theory, think about, I don't even know if we know all the, the issues that are going on with data mining, data collection, how data is being used, where's the consumer, what are the rights of the consumer? It's the industry. In some ways, the industry, has so much more power over the individual consumer, and things that are hidden from the consumer. Are we really informed? These become the issues that we can start to develop. This is an interesting podcast. If you're interested, you can look at new books and communications. You can just type this in an internet search and pull up this podcast. The one reason I bring something to bring out of this podcast was that Saha, the author of this work, examining basically who are the producers, and the question that he raises is that even if more people of color are becoming involved in the newsroom, that the institution itself filters out a lot of different stories, and how those stories are told. So he kind of questions whether or not having that, while there's great value in having a more diverse workforce, and that's something that we should to work towards, that we should not have this illusion by having a more diverse workforce that's going to solve this issue of representation, because there's a logic of that institution, and those institutions that are much more significant than the individual actors within them. Okay, so go back to the base and the superstructure. So the base and the superstructure. So the base are basically the political economy, like how we're producing. The mean includes the means of production, the tools of production. So agricultural-based society, think about it, our tools of production are so different than in contemporary modern day technology, computer technology rich societies itself. So it's that base that influences the superstructure, all these different kind of things. Ideology is, the beliefs of society itself, which shape the base, and it just goes round and round and round and round. So I go back to advertising, super fun to look at. We'll look at it later on this term, early advertising. And then you look at every development of new technology, okay, newsprint and the establishment of advertising, move to radio. Oh, okay, now advertising, it's shifting and changing now. Then we move to television. Whoa, this is a big different change in terms of advertising. These are all changes in the base, which influence things that are coming out of the superstructure, and what's going in the superstructure is helping to shape the base. And then we go from television to computer to social media. It's fascinating. The examination of advertising is fascinating because it's a story of culture. It's a story of history. It's a story of our own history. Super interesting. And just sort of another way to kind of look at this is that political economy is like these different kind of social systems. And I want to emphasize here is that there's not one form of capitalism, socialism. We have one particular form of, we all have nations around the world, they're mixed economies. We have socialist elements in our economy, Medicare, Medicaid, public school systems. So we have a mixed economy. So there's different degrees of those are all bases from a Marxist perspective. If you're interested, this film called Bamboozled by Spike Lee, a fascinating film about representations, about African Americans in film, and tracing that historically, going back to the rise of the Klan. How come I can't think of it? The Klansman was the name of the film. It was the first film, black and white film. It was showed in the White House. I can't remember who was president at the time period, early 1900s. And it basically was a film that gave rise to the Klan. And what Spike Lee is kind of looking through is historically all these different representations. And he tells us sort of through a storyline about the production of hip hop videos. So it's really interesting, thought-provoking, provocative, and all these sort of historical examples and illustrations. So from this perspective, the media promotes dominant power structures. And encourage people to consent, encourages people to adopt the status quo. This is like that hegemony part. So people, the powerful or the powerful can stay where they are, and the system can stay in place through both maybe a strong coercive force in terms of a state, but also through consent, so that we consent to our own oppression. People are taught to consent in everyday life and behavior. This is that hegemony component. And the Marxist theory is that societies must transform over time. People need to become more kind of critical, more aware. And Marx had this idea about, that this sort of utopic state of leading to communism, and that would be the sort of final economic development. Most theorists today, the significant majority, don't hold on to that idea, but that was sort of the idea of the Marxist perspective. And then there's the counter-hegemonic perspective, that there may be the dominant view, but there's also a counter view. And people can engage in popular culture and be counter-hegemonic. They can read the text or interpret that cultural product in a way that is in opposition to what its intent was. So we call that counter-hegemonic. So somebody sees that, somebody sees this kind of thing here. Whoops. She's a female superhero, and you see, okay, well, that's a demonstration of women are being strong and they're being athletic, and this sort of this new idea about gender. But then counter-hegemonic viewpoints say, whoa, I'm going to read against the grain a little bit and say we still have that. It's still the sexualization of females, and even in action films. The reason I brought these up here, these are, so First Blood is a film. Then there's a lot of them. Sylvester Stallone, going back to the 1980s, all these films about, Rambo. There's a lot of academic work written about Rambo, and this is trying to address America's loss of the war in Vietnam. And this is the rise of conservatism in the United States, and the development of, this is the cultural climate in which, that Rambo emerges. Rocky films, fighting Apollo Creed, race relation stuff going on there, the sort of the white triumphing over the black, really kind of interesting things to kind of pull apart. And there's more. So is it entertainment, or is there some other things that are going on that we can kind of, important to critique? 6 different corporations control 90% of the media outlets in the United States. It's like, okay, it's something to think about, the consolidation of power. So if I go back to functionalism, well, yeah, the media provides all these sort of vital functions, and those are important to examine, but it doesn't do a good job of addressing those things like, okay, is there, does the number, the consolidation of media outlets influence what we see? I just think it'd be hard to deny, hard to accept the fact that it doesn't have an influence. I think, it's more of a question to how and to what degree. Direct-to-consumer advertising for pharmaceuticals. There's only 2 countries in the industrialized world that have direct-to-consumer ads. It's the United States and New Zealand. In 1997 is when the United States started allowing pharmaceutical companies to provide direct-to-consumer advertisements. That's kind of a reflection of our culture, our values, whose interests are being protected by that or established by that. That becomes kind of this conflict theory question. Okay, so illustrations of the theory. So Schoolhouse Rock was a program that came out, super fun. Bill on the Hill, Zero, My Hero, Conjunction Function, what's Conjunction Junction, what's your function? All these cool Schoolhouse Rock, kids learning math and grammar in a cool, fun way. Check them out, super fun to watch. Great example of functionalism. Mass media is about learning, education. Even here, mass media can say we're learning culture, cultural values and ideas. Things are going on, changing with culture. They could look at conflict theory within this part. I put this here for conflict theory, this here for functionalism, but I think you could apply, ultimately you could probably apply both. But for conflict theory, to think about that, even though women are in more strong positions to be the hero, it's still this issue of sexualization that starts to become kind of part of that. Okay, the third theme here to think about audience effects. So we're going to put it on the audience now. So we go back to our cultural object thing, the creator. There's kind of a couple different things here that start even teasing it out a little bit more, kind of that social world. Here's the consumer, the individual, the networks, the groups we belong to, the habitus, our ways of thinking and knowing and doing, our belief systems shape how we interpret. So we're going to get into like the audience effects about this stuff is coming in, right? The media, society, culture, producing products, coming down into the audience. The audience can have different interpretations of the text and a text or the object, and it could lead to different effects. So cognitive, the way that we structure our thinking, affective, our emotional states, as well as our behavior, both individually and then at a larger macro level kind of social policy kind of thing. To get there, to get this idea of audience effects, let's kind of first go after this called the triangle of meaning. So here you have, this is the kind of a basic structure of thinking about, thinking about development of meaning. You have the thought, then you have the symbol, and then you have the referent. So the actual object is the referent. The symbol is, so the referent is the actual object. Well, going down here. The symbol is basically that. So what is the representation? And then what thought do we develop? So if I show this to you, right, and you can we can understand pretty quickly that the thought that I develop is going to be different probably than the thought that you develop versus somebody else. And maybe start to go, maybe there's a pattern to that to some way that depending on your race, your social position, race, class, gender, region of the country, other different, your level of, all these different, your age, all these different kind of things can start to shape how you interpret that particular symbol. So that's kind of the idea of the triangle of meaning. So we're going to look at basically under this sort of audience effects piece, things about the influence of symbols on the ways that we think, both in terms of how that influences our own worldview, our own perspective, and ultimately also how that can shape more large things that are going on in society itself. And this will come through. I mean, we go through this throughout the course of terms, so we'll get different examples as we go along. So it's kind of, we're gonna watch this film called Real Engine in, let's see, what week is that? Week 4. Basically about representations of Native Americans in film and providing sort of this examination of those representations, right? So we're gonna get into representations. The symbol of Native American is the referent, the actual object, the individuals. The symbol, the way that individuals are being represented and sort of how that shapes how we think about Native Americans. Think about Native American mascots, this film, More Than a Word, interesting film. And it's important to say too, that not everyone of a particular group has the same view, right? So that not all Native Americans think about Native American mascots in the same way. So it's much more complex than that. So the one thing that's important to remember from the interactionist perspective is that we have the action or the stimulus and then the response. So the stimulus, the example I use in class oftentimes in my 201 class is marijuana is the object, is the stimulus, let's say. So not like a person uses it, just like, let's just look at the object itself. So marijuana as a substance, and then the response, so how we think about that substance, do we think it's going to cause rape or murder? The response is that, our response to it is that we see it as a moral issue. People who use it, we need to incarcerate them. Go down that pathway, right? That's our response. In between that stimulus and response is the interpretation. And what we're interested in a lot of this sort of audience effect stuff is the interpretation level and the outcome. So it's about how we interpret the social world influences our outcome. The Thomas theorem is if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So if we define something as being a particular way, regardless of if objectively it's that way, it's how we define about it and how we think about it, it's real in its consequences. Again, going back, it's thinking about how does the audience interpret the symbolic world and what are the consequences for that? Consequences to one's own identity, as well as consequences at a much more macro level to society itself. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, I'll just touch on it real quick, is that Sapir-Whorf linguistics kind of theory and Benjamin Whorf, Edwin Sapir had this idea that language is a system through which we view the world. We view the world through a lens of language, and language shapes your view of reality itself. So you get, certain words, for example, I guess going back, like the language that we use to describe the world. If I'm not a biologist, if I'm out in a well, and getting into botany, botanists have a larger description system, a language system to describe the world, the botanical world, and they see the world in a different way because they have that language system. When I worked as a clinical social worker for a period of time, working in that field, there's a language system, and working as a clinician, and that becomes a filter through which you view the world. Right, so it's the language, and then the language is a filter that we view the world. So you change the language, you change your view of the world itself. So part of this gets into culture. Not only do we view the world through a lens of language, but we view it through a cultural or symbolic lens in terms of images. So Native American mascots maybe, or representations of Native Americans in film, become a way to sort of think about that. And then finally, the looking glass self is that images can have an impact on how we see ourselves. So through these representations that we see outside, whether that's gendered representations based on class and race and other parts of our identity, they shape our own. This becomes a looking glass self and shape how we view our own self. I just kind of brought these up here thinking about audience, what's going on, kind of unpack these a little bit. The first one here, Jim Beam, the men rode into the saloon is never followed by and ordered a Merlot. Some class stuff going on there, super interesting. Masculinity, ideas of masculinity. It's like what's the impact is, and I think there's definitely got to move away from a cause effect about impact. Media studies and looking at media effects, it's more about a cultural environment. It's never about the individual ad. This becomes sort of, I think, an important distinction. Sometimes, and people say, well, ads don't have any influence on me. It's like, well, it's kind of interesting because why would there be advertising? If advertisers didn't have any influence on people, why would they be doing advertising? So the question isn't whether it does or doesn't. It's more, it creates this cultural landscape that we navigate. It becomes part of our toolkit that's in our toolkit, right? We're learning things about, we see these we're learning things about culture, about gender, about masculinity, femininity, about cultural values, ideals, beliefs, as it's in this cultural environment. So we're moving away from thinking about it's this one ad or this one cultural product is causing something. It's more about it's a soup that we're swimming in, or this ocean of stuff that we're swimming in that starts to, that we have to navigate, and we all navigate it in different ways. Gender and advertising and food, and there's some interesting things that masculinity and meat, this sort of connection, really interesting. There's been a move recently about masculinity, just something more positive in terms of, and who's to define what positive is and how that's defined. And to some degree, I question whether or not the advertising industry is going to play on certain tropes and ideals, and it definitely can move things and has moved things in the past, but I wonder to what extent it's actually, it's trying to sell product. So yeah, can it do that and not fall prey to some of the shock value kind of things or stereotypes and all that kind of stuff? All right. So finally, media representations, basically images, narratives, accounts, frames, circulate in the media, carry this content. They construct meaning, offer understanding of what the world is and why it works in a particular way. So the power of examining the media representations, and we can go back all the way to here, think about media representations that they're being shaped by what's going on, historical, cultural context. We interpret things, maybe sometimes we're passive recipients, sometimes more active. Our social position may influence how we interpret the text. Who's creating the representations, who's creating the text itself. And these are the things that we're gonna start diving into more and more. And then kind of a preview for the podcasts. Hopefully you enjoyed them. They're really fun. It's a great little interaction going on between all three of them, and they just break down all these cool elements within culture itself. Yeah. you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. Make sure you kind of, create that schedule. I think, after the third week, you should be like, oh, okay, I got this thing going on. I hope you're enjoying the discussion group. It's a great way to connect with some of your peers. I focus on the discussion group of getting into examples and illustrations and applications. Try to make an engaging, fun, entertaining, informative space for you to be in. And the groups, if you engage, you may be a leader within the group to help other people engage too. So it takes a couple of leaders within a group to really make that group more dynamic. So I encourage you to get out there, put a little bit of heart in there. I appreciate all you do. Have a good rest of your day, and catch you next week. All right, take care.